Hello and welcome to Hanratty on Karate. This series was intended to just go to 3 parts, but as with most histories of countries, you can't summarize it in just a few small talks. So basically I wanted to go on to Japan. Now, I last left with my last broadcast with a little bit of a talk on 3 incidents that kind of summarized the samurai outlook and the ideology, if you will, of the samurai. And they were like the 47 Ronin and a couple of other vendetta incidents that we discussed in the last episode. Now, the samurai were different classes and they were different things at different times. I know we all like to think of them as the warrior class and all the rest of it, but they were entirely different in different parts of the country and at different periods of the country. The word samurai means basically to serve or one who waits. So they're not always warriors. They do serve and they nearly always served a lord. But later on, as the roles changed, a lot of them went into government. Still so to serve, if you might say. But the role of samurai was basically hereditary. And you have different classes of samurai. Those who fought on horse, those who fought on foot with swords. And then lower down you had foot soldiers, which weren't typically classed as samurai. And these were conscripts, usually from the farms and peasants, and not entirely all voluntary either. But the samurai as a whole were basically a ruling class. And the top level we would know as daimyos or hatamoto, which was different classes. A hatamoto, for example, had the right to an audience with the shogun, as did a daimyo, but just an ordinary samurai didn't. Had to go through channels, or if he was ever heard. Okay, so what we're going to go through now, and we finished up the last of the Heian period, we're going to go to the Meiji period. And this was a major period in the dissolution of the samurai, but not just the samurai, it was a dissolution of the shogunate. Now, the last shogun was Yoshinobu Tokugawa, and what happened was, after the opening of Japan, and it was a gradual process, it wasn't just the sudden appearance of Admiral Perry, as the Americans would like us to believe, who threatened to blow bits out of Yokohama Harbor that opened Japan. It had already been slowly opening, and what the Japanese had done had been playing off a couple of religious factions against each other to get an idea of what was going on in the outside world. And the 2 religious factions, they played upon each other, both Christian, actually, the Dominicans and the Jesuits, both an order of religious monks that thought it was their duty to, brainwash everybody in the world. And the Japanese put up with this because of one particular kind of technology that they brought, and that was what we know as the arquebus, which was a kind of a primitive musket, if you like, which basically changed the way samurai conducted their warlike traits. Prior to arquebus muskets or firearms being used, you'd have a group of samurai, maybe not so many, 200-300 say, with foot soldiers behind. And what the procedure would be was for the champion to go up, shout out his lineage and who he belonged to and his whole family history, and challenge their top guy, who'd also come out and do the same thing. So after that little fight, you'd maybe get skirmishers running to and fro, taking chops at each other and all that, until battle was enjoined. So this is kind of a primitive thing. And what changed this actually was one of the Mongol invasions, when all of a sudden the samurai were subjected to bombs. And this would be probably the first use of gunpowder, this in the 12th century, that had been seen on the Japanese mainland. Now, the Japanese were fortunate that they managed to knock back this invasion of Mongols, although it was costly because it was a war of defense. And a war of defense doesn't bring you many spoils of war to dish out amongst your retainers. So there are a lot of mumbling about that. They then decided that they would build a wall around the bay. And I think I mentioned this in my last broadcast. And it was really successful, even though they were vastly outnumbered. I think Genghis Khan sent something like 140,000 troops and 900 ships. But there was a typhoon came down through the strait to save Japan and destroyed a lot of it. And so this is where you get the term kamikaze from, which is roughly means divine wind or wind of the gods. And this informed the nationalistic ideology in Japan that they were protected by the gods. Anyway, to move on into the Meiji period, the shogunate was becoming more and more dissolute and subject to nepotism, and they controlled everything. The emperor didn't have much of a say, and everybody in Japan looked upon the emperor as divine, and his line had run down from time immemorial, something like the 360th emperor or whatever. So they wanted to try to modernize the country. There was a great move to modernize the country after it was opened up following the visit of Admiral Perry and the visit of British ships and Portuguese ships and Dutch ships, which kind of controlled the what we would call the East Indies. Yeah, the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. It was great trading companies that had ports all over the place. The rule was for most Western countries to try to expand through trade and just get more money, really, and take over the local population, if you like. But Japan, and I've mentioned this before, are fantastic imitators. They will look at a system, anything in particular, how it's made, or an item or whatever, and they will imitate it, but they'll imitate it to perfection. And this is what happened here. They wanted to be a modern country, and so they thought the first thing to do was reinstate the rule of the emperor. And so they moved the capital from Kyoto to Edo, which is now Tokyo. That was the first thing. And this wasn't a new thing. Most emperors moved capitals as they took over the role. But it had been in Kyoto for hundreds of years. So they moved it to Edo, and they reinstated the emperor as ruler with a system under him, an administrative system. So this administrative system, what they did was they looked upon different systems, and various parties supported these different government models, and they looked upon, like they looked at the US Constitution, but it was rejected as too liberal and too controlling over the emperor. The same with the British parliamentary system. They didn't like that because the emperor wouldn't have had as much control as they thought he should have. The French and the Spanish systems were also rejected. They thought they were too open to despotism. Whether they're right or not, I don't know. Eventually, they adopted the Prussian model. Also at this time, they reinstated Shinto as the national religion. Up until now, they'd had a kind of a mixed version of Shinto and Buddhism, Shinbutsu, that kind of was on its own. And this had also split up into a whole bunch of different sects, as religion is wont to do. So a lot of things came about at this time when what we call the Meiji Restoration. It was actually one of the fastest modernizations and reforms of any country anywhere in history. Now, it started in 1868, and what they were looking at is not just bringing Japan into the modern era, but expanding Japan as well, and making it into an international power, if you like. They'd seen the way the British and the Dutch and the French Indochina had gone about their business, and they didn't see any reason why they shouldn't. Now, quite close to Japan, we have the Ryukyu Islands, which is now Okinawa. So these were annexed in the Meiji period as well. Now, the Ryukyu Islands had a little bit of a different political system. They were subject to China. They paid tributes to China, as well as tributes to the Satsuma clan, who'd more or less annexed them or conquered them probably around the 13th century. But we all know Japan was split up into all these little groups and clans and daimyos and whatever, and the Satsuma clan had laid claim to the Ryukyu Islands. So what we have is the Ryukyu Islands were annexed by the Japanese, and in 1879, the Matsuda and the army went down there and they issued a draft to the Okinawans to say that now the Ryukyu Island, Ryukyu Ken would be abolished and the Okinawan Ken would be instituted. Actually, it was Ryukyu Han. Han was the system of government that they had in Okinawa. It's the same kind of system that they had previously in Japan because they copied it off the Chinese. A lot of this all took place within a very short period of time, and so there's a great upheaval in the country. Now, besides changing the system of government, annexing the Ryukyu, they also instituted military conscription for all classes. And this one edict on its own was practically the death knell for the samurai. So the military was modeled, again, they looked at different systems. The military model was modeled after the French system, and they still have the French ranks, if you like, within the army. So after they'd built up their army and annexed Okinawa, and they had a little incident in what's now Taiwan, what was then Formosa, where a group of Okinawan fishermen were massacred by the local population for some reason or other. This kind of prompted a response because now the Japanese felt, hey, the Okinawans now belong to us and we're not going to take it. So this instituted feelings against Okinawa, China, and in particular Korea. Now, they invaded Korea and they took over Korea, and they actually held Korea right until after World War II. All that time it wasn't called Korea, it was called Chosen. And then after World War II, of course, Korea got itself in its own mess, along with the help from our good buddy, the United States, who fought a war there but didn't get anything out of it because they left it exactly as they found it, with a big line across the middle, and north and south. But anyway, the Japanese decided the time was ripe for expansion. And this was a time of imperialism, and they wanted basically to emulate the European nations and attain an equality status with the West. The European powers were laying claim to anything that they could lay their hands on, as we know from the British Empire and the Dutch and everybody else who was stealing territory left, right, and centre. So what we see next is the Sino-Chinese War, where they invaded China. And this was done a number of times, but they did invade China, and they went on to have a war with Russia, the Sino-Japanese War. But there was a double doctrine, if you like, that was prevalent in the Japanese government at the time. And one was the Southern Expansionist doctrine, which is called the Nanshinron, or Southern Road. And this said that you'd rather go through Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, more as a sphere of interest, and they were more of a potential value to the empire for economic and territorial gains. And the opposing political doctrine was Hakushinron, which was Northern Expansion. And this was supported more by the army, which stated the same thing, but mostly for Manchuria and Siberia. So the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War tied down millions of Japanese troops in China and was kind of negative towards Japanese expansionism. Now, in World War I, Japan was an ally of Great Britain and the Allies, and at this time, they were able, at the end of the war, to seize a bunch of territories and, try to hold on to them. So this is what they did in Manchuria and, Russia and stuff like that. And Russia was going through its own kind of turmoil at the end of World War I with the Bolshevik revolutions and the Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, and all the rest of it. And so they really had a tough time trying to protect the far east of Russia, as the Trans-Siberian Railroad wasn't fully operational at the time. So this was just the start of the imperialistic expansion, and this carried on into 1937, where the Japanese invaded China again. Now, China was in a state of turmoil. You had Chiang Kai-shek, who was the nationalist leader, and Mao Zedong, who was the communist leader. Chiang Kai-shek was a jerk, absolute just didn't mind killing off millions of his own people as long as he didn't give anything to Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong actually approached him at one time and said, look, we'll fight with you and get rid of the Japanese, but Chiang Kai-shek wouldn't have it. Anyway, what happened was back in Japan, was an amazing surge of nationalism, and they were taught that everybody else was barbarians, if you like, and psychologically the schools brainwashed the scholars or the would-be soldiers and soldiers coming up into thinking that everybody else was a barbarian and should be treated as such. Now bear in mind, Japan had only had a national education system in place since 1895, so the 1930s, it was only like 35 years they'd had this in place. When you look at karate history, this was when Itosu was bringing out the heian katas in the school systems in 1895. So between that and the Sino-Japanese War in 37, or invasion in 37, is only 35 years. So, it's not much at all. So they were actually brainwashing the kids, and the Sino-Japanese War in 37, and the invasion of China, was remarkable, and you can look up history books on this, and I remember reading this years and years ago. The brutality and the barbarity that came out of this war that was so important for a lot of the people was just horrible. There's a book called The Rape of Nanking, if you want to look at it. There's lots of other books, but that's the one that stuck in my mind. I remember reading it 30, 40 years ago, actually more than that, and thinking, how could people be so horrible? Just within a period of 2 months, there was over 300,000 Chinese that were massacred in Nanking. And this is just in a period of 2 months. And it wasn't just massacred. They were chopped up, they were used for testing swords, there was rape of the population, burnings, crucifixions. It was just horrible, just a horrible, horrible thing. Now, this kind of attitude kind of prevailed throughout the Second World War with the Japanese, and they were always looked upon as barbaric. The expansion that came about after the 37 invasion of China, this is prior to World War II, really started to push economic benefits to Japanese and to Japanese immigrants. So they started to look at, besides the northern expansion, they started to look at Nanshinron, which was the southern expansion. This is basically where they started to move into the Southeast Asia, French Indochina, of course, and Philippines. And right up until they came up against the Americans at Pearl Harbor. This really gave them access to a lot of raw materials that they don't have on the Japanese mainland. It's very sparse in raw materials. They got rubber, they got hemp, they got copra. They started investments in all of this stuff. They got Singapore and Batavia. So the industrialization of Japan came along at a terrific rate. They also got a huge population surge as well. So everything was going along great. The Navy was growing in strength, so they were able to protect their overseas interests at that time if diplomacy failed, which of course it did. And they started to pursue a policy of overseas migration. This is what you find in Hawaii. Like, Hawaiian immigration was huge with Japanese. And they had a lot of relations in the Pacific prior to the war. And they really started to have a presence all the way through the South Pacific and on until they basically got too big for the boots, if you like. And when they attacked Pearl Harbor and the Americans declared war on them, then they kind of went a step too far. They picked on a guy that was just a bit too big for them. Now, the Japanese army was disbanded after, and in 1949 they had to hand back Korea and all of the other territories that they had. In China, Mao Zedong overcame Chiang Kai-shek, pushed all the nationalist Chinese, or what was left of them, onto what we now know as Taiwan. That's where they still are. And so there's always going to be an argument with China over Taiwan, or Formosa as they called it, and everybody else. My opinion is it'll probably be sorted out with diplomacy. China's getting to be something that's to be envied rather than hated at the moment. and other countries are going through their own policies of expansionism or nationalism, which always ends in failure. When you look at the rise and fall of empires over the millenniums, you're either going to get a character that comes out that absolutely ruins it, or it's going to pick up an ideology that is not suitable for everybody else, or it's going to get too nationalistic and it's going to collapse in on itself, which we've seen time and time again throughout history. Anyway, this is a very, very short look at the history of Japan over 4 episodes. I really would like to go into it deeper, but maybe I've piqued your interest and you can have a look at it and see for yourself. There's tons of books on Japanese history, not all of them romantic, particularly from 1937 on, but then after the war, who knows, people should have learned their lessons, but some people never will. And what we're seeing now in certain countries is a replaying of a playbook from the 1930s. Who knows where that's going? But that's Japan, a different country, different ideologies, different people. I think Japan came out of it very, very well, and hopefully they'll carry on. I hope so, because actually it's a culture that I now admire, and it's a place I love to visit. It certainly holds a lot of interest for me. Whenever I visit there, I'm always envious of the way that they've come about, but hopefully now that they've taken something that they want to imitate it, made it their own, they've now found their own identity, I think they have, and they're using that as an advertisement to the rest of the world, saying, hey, look, you don't have to be a jerk, you can do your own thing, and all you have to do is consider everybody else. Okay, so that's it for Hanratty on Karate in this little section. I'll get back to the normal, regular talk. If you've got any questions or comments, criticisms even, I don't mind, give me a call. Take care.